Are you looking to profit from the leasehold reforms? Or perhaps you're looking to know where the opportunities lie? Well, this video is made perfect for you. Join me in this video as we very briefly describe and explain the leasehold reform, but more importantly, we discuss 2 strategies on how to profit from the leasehold reform. Now make sure you watch this video all the way through to the very end to find out what those 2 very profitable strategies are. And then I end and leave you with a killer tip when it comes to buying leasehold property and to make sure you don't buy a dud flat. So before we get into the video, for those of you that don't know me, my name is Marco. I'm a portfolio landlord, property investor, developer and mentor. And as you can probably tell, I'm very passionate about residential property. So the structure of this video is as follows. We're very briefly going to discuss the leasehold reform, what it excludes. And as I say very briefly, we're going to be a couple of minutes on here before we move on to the strategies. It's really important that we hammer down and go over what the changes include. Then we're going to come on to the 2 strategies that are available to us as investors to profit from these changes. And lastly, I'm going to give you a killer tip on how to make sure you actually buy a decent flat and not one that's going to cost you in the future. Now, before we get into this, I have leasehold, so I have individual flats. I also have a block of flats where I own the freehold too as well. I'm well versed in flats, don't get me wrong, it's not my preference and I've been very vocal on that on the channel. I much prefer to buy a freehold standard house rather than a flat, but there is a lot of opportunity when it comes to leaseholds, and certainly if I come across a decent opportunity that I can pick up at a great price, I'm all for it. And saying that now, I've actually agreed an offer on a leasehold property today. So there's so much opportunity in the market, hence why I'm making this video for everyone to see where the opportunity lies. So the Leasehold Reform Act is now law, but it's going to take a few years for it to come into effect. Who knows what the Labour government is going to make of it? It's up to them to really push this through. So until that very moment, which I'm hoping will be sometime in 2025 or 2026, the current laws in situ remain. However, let's discuss what these future laws could come to look like in only a year or two's time. And we're going to very briefly go over a couple of bullet points. So number 1, the most important thing in my opinion from this reform is the idea that it's going to make extending a lease cheaper, which is really important. So how is this going to come about? Well, for those short leases, when I say short, leases with 80 years or less, at the moment you have marriage value. And the idea behind this reform is actually abolishes marriage value. So the cost to extend your lease would, hypothetically, in the future, should be a fraction of what it is today. And we'll come on to more about this very soon. The second change is that when you extend a lease, the number of years will increase to 990 years as standard, which is great because in the past, when you extended the lease, normally you weren't extending it for that many years. So fingers crossed, you do this once and you never have to do it again in your lifetime. The third change is it gives leaseholders greater transparency. So when it comes to things like service charges, a leaseholder can clearly see how that's derived and how it's come about. The fourth change is it makes taking over management of a property easier for leasehold. So for example, maybe you've got a flat in a building and there's a few of you come together and you want to take over that management. This reform will make it slightly easier for you to do so. Number 5, it's suggested that the leaseholder won't have to pay the freeholder's legal costs when making a claim. Number 6, there's going to be a redress scheme where leaseholders can challenge poor practice. Number 7, a maximum time and expenditure will be set when it comes to buying and selling homes. So the information you request from a leasehold point of view will be delivered quicker and cheaper, fingers crossed. So they're just a number of variables that are included in this reform. There are a few more bits and bobs, but they're the main salient points that I've taken from this. So the question is, where does the opportunity lie? Well, in my opinion, there are 2 really key strategies that we can profit from as investors, not only now, but in the future. And there are some investors that have been doing what I'm about to say for a considerable amount of time. And I think now is a really good time to be getting into it. Yes, hopefully you only have to wait a couple of years to turn it around and profit from this investment. But in my opinion, it's a really good time to be getting involved in these types of strategies, as it's not going to be decades until you can profit, likely going to be years rather than decades. So without further ado, let's get into the first strategy where you can profit from the leasehold reforms. So the first strategy is to buy leaseholds with short leases. Now, what is a short lease? As I've already mentioned in the video, a short lease is roughly speaking a lease with 80 or less years. And why is this? Well, at the current time, anything that's got 80 or less years is considered a short lease because if you want to extend that lease, you have to pay marriage value. Now, without getting into too much detail, and marriage value is probably a video for another day, it's essentially the difference between the value of that property with only 80 years left on the lease and the value of the property property up here with say 990 years left on the lease. Now, obviously, if it's a longer lease, the property is going to be worth more. If it's only got 80 years, it's not going to be worth as much. So the difference is that marriage value. And typically speaking, if we're extending a lease now or before this law comes into effect, we have to pay marriage value to the freehold. And normally speaking, don't take me on this, but this is kind of a rough figure up north, we pay about 50% of that difference in value to the freeholder, or at least that's what they can expect when we're looking to extend that lease. Now, with the proposed abolishment of marriage value, which is really key and a huge game changer here, all of a sudden that freeholder has no right to that gain in value. All we have to do is pay a reasonable sum, including the legal charges, and we don't have to pay any marriage value. So that's really, really important. So what could you be doing now? Well, you could be buying properties with short leases, banking on it for a year or two, waiting for the abolishment of marriage value to come into effect, and then approaching the freeholder and say, right, I'd like to extend the lease, please. And it's going to be a far reasonable sum compared to if you were extending that lease right here today. So this is a really great strategy. It's a very profitable strategy. It's one that I'm certainly embarking upon. And I've got some properties where I have short-ish leases and I'm looking to extend them in the future. I'm not looking to extend them now, but in the future, when the reform is a bit more favourable, I will extend them then. So it's a great kind of short to medium term play. And this is why I say it's a great time to get into this type of strategy. You're not going to be waiting decades. You're going to be waiting a couple of years, then you can extend that lease and see the value of that property skyrocket. So, Marco, you've told me short leases are great, but how on earth do we find these types of properties? I'm going to give you a couple of areas to look in. So first of all, auction. So you tend to come across flats with a low number of years left on the lease in auction. Now, why is that? Well, a flat that has a short number of years left on the lease typically isn't mortgageable. Most lenders don't like to touch it. It's too high risk of them. So if a seller wants to sell that type of property, they can either sell it on the open market for cash, not mortgage, or they can throw it in the auction and get a cash price for it and get it sold fast. So the auction is a really good place to look. Also, when properties get repossessed, they go in the auction. So check out your local auctions, have a look at any flats. You won't have to dive too deep to find the number of years left on the lease and act accordingly. The second method I have for you today for looking for short leases is to use Rightmove and Zoopla. Now, if we are searching in Rightmove and Zoopla, we have a search function. We can search by a keyword, and in there you could put something like years left on lease, or number of years left on lease, or something to that effect, to kind of play around on number of years. And that will bring up results where in those particular listings, the agent who's selling the property has mentioned in the description that there are X years left on the lease. So there could be 50 years left on the lease, 60 years left on the lease, whatever, right? So that's another way how you can come about finding these types of properties. Now, the last method, which is really good and it requires a bit of work to begin with, but once you've identified a property that has a very low number of years left on the lease, well, odds are all the other flats or most of the other flats in that development also have a low number of years left on the lease. So you can target that development. Anyone looking to sell in that development, you can snap up those units and you can be putting a lot of your time, effort and resources into maybe a couple of developments, but with your knowledge and your skill set that in a couple of years that property is going to be worth much more after you have extended the lease at a reasonable cost. So number one is the short lease strategy. Well, let's come on to number two. Now, number two is a strategy where we look for properties with high ground rents. Now, why on earth is this a strategy, Marco, and how does it work? Well, a high ground rent, which is the rent that we pay every year to the freeholder, whoever owns the freehold of that particular property, is slightly problematic because if it's too high, again, mortgage lenders don't like it and they don't like to lend on it. But not only that, if the terms of that lease is too strict, for example, if rent is doubled every 10 years or if there's a rent review every 5 years, most lenders don't like lending on such strict leases. So again, if we've got this high ground rent combined with a very strict lease, there's an opportunity for us. And again, we can be buying it now and in the future we can profit from this. And how do we do this? Well, as I've already mentioned, we can amend and modify that lease by extending the lease. We can extend that lease, reduce the ground rent, and therefore the property now becomes mortgageable. And because the property becomes mortgageable, we can now boast a far higher price on the open market. So actually within the reform itself is really interesting because if you extend the lease, hypothetically that ground rent should reduce to nil or a peppercorn or £1. So that's one way of getting around this issue of high ground rent. It's by extending the lease and then that ground rent starts anew. So as you can see, the actual solution to both these strategies are fairly similar. It's extending the lease, but there are two different issues. The first issue point being, we've got a property with a very low number of years left on the lease. And the second issue is we've got a property with very high ground rent. Now, on the topic of ground rent, typically speaking, if your ground rent plus service charge is, say, over 2% of the purchase price of the property, lenders don't like to lend. In fact, some lenders don't even like it to be over 1%. However, there is some flexibility. Some lenders are open to it. And if there's a very good reason as to why that service charge is so high, for example, there could be a 24/7 concierge, then of course that's acceptable and understandable from some lenders. So how do we find these types of opportunities? How do we find opportunities where the ground rents are high? Well, it's a little bit more tricky than the first option where we have a low number of years left on the lease. But again, check auctions. These properties tend to come up in the auction time and time again because they're not typically saleable through the open market, through the mortgaged open market section. They typically go as cash buyers or into the auction. So check out your auction. It's very easy to have a look at what the ground rent is for a particular leasehold. You won't be searching too long. Another option is, again, go to Rightmove, filter by flats, and type in the keyword area cash buyers or cash only or something to that effect. And the reason why we're filtering by cash only is because typically these leases that we can buy are cash only purchases. Lenders won't lend if the ground rent is too high. And again, lastly, similar to the previous strategy, once you've found the development where in fact the ground rents are very high, probably other leases are struggling with this too. And if those leases want to sell, they have an option of selling to you quickly at a good price. And in a couple of years, you can turn things around, reduce that ground rent by extending the lease and boost the property value. So I promised you a key tip before we leave here today. And I can't stress this enough, so really do listen carefully. There are reasons why some leaseholds are in the auction. Now, they may not be flats that you want to own. Okay, so here are a couple of tips to make sure you don't buy a dud flat and to make sure your purchase is going to be a happy one. So first of all, we need to do due diligence on the development itself. Do we actually want to own a flat within this development? Google it first of all. Google the name of that development. Make sure it's actually got a good reputation. If you can, view the property. I always recommend to view the property. Not even so much the individual flat. What we're looking at is the development. Are we happy with the development? Is it being looked after? Is it being cared for? Is there a healthy budget to help fix things that go wrong in the communal areas? Don't be afraid to ask residents and to ask tenants and to ask owners. In fact, you'll often find there's a Facebook group for each and every development. Join that Facebook group. See what people are talking about. Are they talking about the issues in the building? How often are they posting about issues? Are they posting about issues on a weekly basis that aren't being fixed? Is that a development that you want to buy into? Perhaps not. But in fact, if they're talking about positive things, nothing to do with maintenance, and it's all trivial matters, then actually you can be reasonably confident that this is the development that you want to buy into. And my last tip for you today is think of your exit. Now, what is the exit? Are we selling or are we going to mortgage the property later? Well, either way, we need to make sure the property is mortgageable, because if we're going to sell it, the person that's willing to pay us the most is going to buy it with a mortgage. So we need to make sure this property is not on a blacklist. And you'll see lenders sometimes publish their blacklist on the developments that they don't lend to. If they get an application and they see the name of this development, they will not lend to it no matter what. So check that development isn't blacklisted by a particular lender that you're looking to use. And again, all these things put together just gives us a better idea of this opportunity. It gives us a better idea of the development and if it's something we want to own going forward 5, 10, 15, 20 years. Because let's face it, we don't have to sell this property. We can increase the value, we can finance it, and we can keep it and rent it and forget about it. Of course, we can choose to sell, but again, if we choose to sell, maybe we have to do the hard work all over again to get that next property. And as you've probably alluded to, my kind of philosophy and my ethos with property is try not to sell if you can, keep it, and it's going to reward you in the future. So to summarize, we've discussed two strategies. The first is buying flats with a low number of years on the lease, extending that lease to increase the number of years, therefore increasing the value. The second is looking for flats where we have a high ground rent, extending the lease to reduce that ground rent, again, thereby increasing the value. Do you have a question? Do you have a comment? Please do comment below this video. And as you know, I respond to all comments or all nice comments on the channel personally. What to do next? Well, if you haven't already booked a call with me, do that. The link is in the description. Failing that, I'd love to see you on the very next video. And in fact, I'm going to let YouTube decide what it wants to present to you. It probably knows you better than I know you. However, that being said, if you are looking to view or watch any more leasehold related videos, head to my channel, just click leasehold in the search box and you'll find a couple of really good leasehold videos for you to dive straight into. I wish you all the very best with your property investing day. Goodbye.